What would you do if you took your favorite hike on a familiar path, but this time you came across a strange, hidden village that you'd never noticed before? And what if this village is filled with a diverse group of people that look desperate and out of place? And what if when you tried to help them, they spoke to you like they felt sorry for you? Would you trust them? When we had initially found this village, we knew that something was off. The entrance was a bizarre anomaly in the tree line, and the people inside looked worn down and stressed out. I could see it in their face. They looked desperate and out of touch with reality. But Bobby and I were forced to confront them when we caught what they were doing to Heidi. But instead of saving Heidi, we too became victims to their odd ritual. And this ritual is filled with games and tests. We easily could have died if it wasn't for the tips given to Heidi about these games from a man named Dr. Doyle. We beat the final test and we arrived back in this weird village. And we were standing there face to face with the man that not only gave us those life-saving tips, but was also the ringleader of this village and had forced us into these sick games in the first place. So I'm standing in this freaky village for the second time in 24 hours, and I'm looking into the eyes of the man that did this to us. Bobby and I start to march up to this guy to confront him, and this guy has his palms up in an attempt to calm us down, but it wasn't going to help him. And now all the other villagers are circling around us as if we're about to have an old school schoolyard fight. Dr. Doyle has no idea that I'm undefeated at recess, and he's about to get the verbal whooping of a lifetime. Not to mention, if he says anything even remotely slick, I'm gonna Batista bomb him through a table. Or at the very least, put him in a full Nelson like the good old days. But as I'm closing the distance on him with my right finger pointing directly at his face, but as I'm getting ready to blurt out my first question towards him, I get taken slightly off balance, and it feels like somebody grabbed my right shoulder. And the reason it threw me off balance was because it was the same arm that I was pointing with, and it was the same leg I was stepping with. So the perfectly timed tug on my right shoulder forced me to bend at my waist slightly, bringing my ear down a couple inches, so somebody shorter than me could whisper in it. And I also felt at the same time the blade of a woman's hand resting on my cheek, as if she was getting ready to tell me a secret. She was leaning her body weight into my side, and she began to delicately whisper. All she said was, "My vote is with you. Whoever you want, just tell me." And then she slid her right hand that was covering her mouth down to my bicep, and she took her left hand that was cupping my shoulder down to my tricep, and she gave my arm a light squeeze followed by a light caressing. And it had taken me so off guard because I was gearing up for an altercation. I was ready to start shouting at Dr. Doyle, and this woman just floated into frame to deliver that one line to me and only me. It felt so out of place in this situation, and it made no sense to me why she would do something like that. And the odd flirtation of it was also jarring. Not to mention the look in her eyes when I turned towards her was salacious and borderline scandalous. It was as if she was expecting a negative repercussion from what she had just did, but she enjoyed stirring the pot. So I turned to Bobby to see what his reaction is to what just happened to me, but I see that he's looking in the opposite direction. And I realized that the same thing had just happened to him, but his woman was much more recognizable to me. She was the one that Heidi was aiming most of her animosity towards when we had first entered through the hole in the trees. So these two girls that just whispered into Bobby and I's ears were clearly the root of the drama of this place, and they were absolutely shameless about it. The tension in the area was palpable, and I could see all of the villagers that had surrounded us knew that it was about to boil over because of what they had just done. I could tell they were waiting for our next move because they didn't know if it was going to boil over between us and Dr. Doyle or something about these two women that had just whispered to us. And before I was able to lead the charge and be the one that erupted this altercation, Heidi jumped in and started barking at these two girls. She aggressively said, "Do you two ever stop playing? It's literally their first day, Blake." And she said that first sentence to the girl that whispered into Bobby's ear. So this girl, clearly named Blake, was clearly Heidi's arch nemesis. And then Heidi turned her attention towards the girl that whispered in my ear, and she said, "Don't let her manipulate you, Serena. Have some empathy for these guys." Heidi was gesturing towards Bobby and I when she said, "these guys," but I wasn't sure why she was encouraging them to show us empathy. But before I figured out why she would do that, this girl Blake clapped back at Heidi in such a snarky tone. Her body language and tone of voice was reminiscent of a high school mean girl in the early 2000s. And this girl goes, "Hey Heidi, did you ever stop talking to Corey when I asked you to?" And I saw a little bit of embarrassment on Heidi's face, which was very new, because Heidi wasn't the embarrassed type, but for some reason what this girl said struck a nerve with her. Heidi, even though feeling very awkward, she managed to say, "Blake, you know that's not the same thing." And again, Blake, sounding like Regina George herself, goes, "You're right. You just met these two. Corey was my fiance." And that one line that Blake dropped caused gasps around the rest of the villagers, and it looked as if these two were about to start ripping each other's hair out. But as intriguing as this juicy drama was, and as potentially entertaining as this catfight was about to be, it was going to have to wait because I didn't care much about their little relationship drama. And clearly Bobby was more fed up than me because he cut off whatever they were doing and he started barking at Dr. Doyle. He walked right up into Dr. Doyle's face, nose to nose, and he said exactly what I wanted to say. He just beat me to it. He pointed directly at Heidi and snarled, "Why did you do that to her?" And then on the back end of his sentence, before Dr. Doyle could chime in and reply, he added on top of it, insult to injury, "She trusted you and you betrayed her." Heidi tried to jump in this situation, trying to imply that Dr. Doyle didn't betray her. But we were very sick of anybody else here talking other than him, so I put my hand up towards her like, "Let the man speak." So I'm standing there, staring at Dr. Doyle's face, trying to get a gauge of what his intentions are or what his emotions in this situation are. I'm trying to see if there's guilt on his face, or if he's gonna attempt to lie, or if there's aggression on his face and he's looking for a fight. And mind you, Bobby and I are in his face, borderline picking a fight. And with what we had just been through, taking a little bit of anger out on somebody who caused it would have hit the spot. But as I'm staring into this man's soul through the top of my eyes with my fists clenched until my knuckles are white and my jaw tightened until you could see the striations on the side of my head and in my temples, all I see in this man's eyes is pity. But he wasn't feeling sorry for himself, and he wasn't feeling guilty for what he did to Heidi. He wasn't scared of me or Bobby. He was looking at us as if he pitied us. He looked like your parent that is about to tell you that the family dog died while you were at school. To be honest, he looked like he had some really bad news for people that he genuinely cared about, and he was going to be the one that had to break it to them. And I tried to not show him that I was picking up on this. I wanted to stay angry because being angry is easy. But when somebody's looking at you the way he was looking at us, it makes you very internally uncomfortable. Because you start to question your stance on the dilemma. And you start thinking about all of the possible things that he must know that you're ignorant of that would make him feel this level of pity towards you. And in my chest, I could feel the confusion growing. But there was nothing that I could do other than demand to know why. Why are you looking at me like that? So that's exactly what I said. Tell me why you're looking at me like that. And in a very empathetic and borderline scared tone, Dr. Doyle said the first words that came out of his mouth since we had arrived. This man said, "Please tell me you don't have kids at home. That's going to make this process much harder." And as I'm trying to comprehend what he just said, I start reactively answering his question by shaking my head. Like my body was replying, shaking my head no, to tell him like, "No, I don't have any kids," but what a ridiculous thing to say. And in my head, I'm thinking, why does that matter? And what process are you talking about? But Bobby was doing the same thing that I was doing, reactively shaking his head no. And Dr. Doyle seemed to be visibly relieved that we were both saying no, we don't have kids at home. As if that answer from both of us was going to make this situation so much better. His reaction genuinely pissed me off because I didn't want him to feel any relief. I didn't want him to feel like he regained any control in the situation. I wanted him to feel like he was on the back foot, so I followed up by saying, "What are you on about?" I wanted him to feel weird about what he was saying, but for some reason, the momentum of this conversation seemed to be shifting into his favor. I could feel his confidence growing, even though his eyes were still darting around. and he was still clearly grasping at straws, trying to figure out what he was going to say next. But I still felt the control slipping away from us, especially when he followed up by saying this: "There's some things that you guys have to understand about what happens next." And I'm just standing there like, why is this guy talking like he is in control here? And why do I internally feel like he's in control? Why does it feel like it's shifting towards him? And as much as I wanted answers about this entire thing, the panic of this going differently than I had imagined made me internally want to leave. I started to become hyper aware of my surroundings, and I started scanning all of the villagers that had surrounded us. And I wasn't sure if his confidence was building because all of these people were in on some type of ambush plan. So I'm trying to shoot aggressive looks at anybody I can make eye contact with to try to scare them off from trying anything. But as I'm looking around and I'm trying to start altercations with my eyes, I noticed that every single person here is looking at us with that same level of pity. And if I'm being honest with you, I wish they looked like an angry mob. I wish I caught some looks and could pick some fights in the crowd, because their demeanor about this whole situation was throwing me off. It was like a group of people walking up to a tragedy, and they looked like they were genuinely, from deep in their hearts, sorry for us. But I'm standing there and I'm like, they're looking like they're sorry for me, but I should feel sorry for them, because these people are in absolute shambles. And it wasn't just their odd mismatching clothes or their below average hygiene. They all had something wrong with them, and it wasn't anything crazy. They weren't major deformities. They weren't like the hills have eyes. There was just like a thing off about each one of them, like scars, or they had an eye patch, or they were missing an ear, or they had a visible limp, like they were clearly in ongoing pain. And in that moment, I felt like they had all been through some level of interrogation or some form of torture, because all of the injuries that they had seemed very specific and very intentional. But all of the stimulation and visual information was overloading. It was overwhelming for me. All I wanted to do was leave. I just wanted to get out of there. And luckily, that's all Bobby wanted as well. Because his rebuttal to Dr. Doyle was, there's something that you're gonna need to understand. We're leaving this freaky little village you built. Heidi, feel free to come with us. Doug, let's get out of here. That was enough for me. I'm good. Let's skedaddle, big dog. I'm good on this whole situation. So we turn around to start walking back towards that big hole in the trees that we initially came in. And I look towards Heidi like, yo, you coming? And I realized that all the trust that we had built with her was out the window. She was nothing but one of these weird cult members, because she couldn't even get herself to look up from the floor. It's clear that her allegiance is towards the people that were torturing her, and she has no intention of letting us help her. There's nothing that we could do to help a lost cause like that. And as we start picking up the pace, fully committing to leaving this group behind, Dr. Doyle shouts over to us in such an odd way. This man says, "There's no need to run, guys. Nobody's chasing you. Go slow, take your time climbing out. We don't need any busted noses." I hated the way that he said that. He sounded like a parent shouting over to their child, trying to keep them safe. And he used the tone as if he knows something that we don't. Like we're so brand new to the world that he's got to let us know to climb out of this safe. Like, dude, we climbed in, we know. We have no idea if this is some type of decoy and he's trying to buy time to close off the exit. So naturally, we start picking up the pace a little bit into a light jog. We get a little bit of distance from the group and we're closing in on the hole in the trees that we came in initially. And I still hear Dr. Doyle continuing to call over to us that nobody's chasing us and we don't need to run. And when I look back over my shoulder, he's not lying. Everybody's standing exactly where they were. He's standing in place just watching us, making sure that we're safe, and the rest of the village members are dispersing in a very sad manner. I continue to hear him shouting in the distance, "Please be careful, guys. Slow down a little bit." And this is only making us pick up speed. He's being so weird. Everything about this is throwing us off. So we start picking up speed. At this point, we're in a healthy run. And we're not going so fast that I can't look back at him, that I need to like watch every step that I take. But we're going fast enough that there's no way he's going to be able to catch up. And as we're about 10 feet from the hole in the trees, I look back at him one more time. and he has his fists clenched together and his face is grimacing as if he's watching a street skater attempt a very dangerous trick and he's expecting a gruesome injury. Part of me is second guessing our actions, but most of me knows that I'm going to feel much better when I hop out of this bizarre circle in this tree line and out of this village. In the base of this opening, it's not very high. It's not like we're going to have to climb out of this thing. It was about 2.5 feet off the ground, so at the pace that Bobby and I are running, we're going to be able to easily hop out of this thing. We weren't even going to have to touch this thing. We probably didn't need to break our stride. All we got to do is hop over this hurdle and we're out of here. So I load up for a single leg jump and I find out why Dr. Doyle told us to take our time. My big toe hit it first, followed by my kneecap, followed by my nose and my forehead. I collided with what felt like a plexiglass wall. These absolute freak shows put up a see-through barrier to trap us in here, but didn't want us to be able to see that we were locked in, because we could see right through it. There was no glare of the sun, there was no streaks on it, there was no way to tell that there was a barrier between us and the outside. So we both ran face first into this plexiglass barrier like an excited dog who had never experienced a glass door. There's nothing worse than getting hit by something that you didn't see coming, and there's nothing more humiliating than running into a glass wall. And there's nothing more terrifying than seeing a man who has clearly intentionally trapped you, slowly walking up behind you as you're nursing an injury. And he's walking so slowly that it exudes this confidence that he knows for sure that you have nowhere to run. Dr. Doyle is walking up to us like he is not in a hurry, and he's not even slightly concerned that we're gonna get up and run away and try to find a different exit. He's walking up to us like he's done this 100 times, but Dr. Doyle must have forgot that the last time that we saw him, we pointed 2 barrels in his face. So I got to my feet, putting most of my weight on my left leg because my right knee took the brunt of the impact. And I look towards Bobby and he's clearly thinking the same thing that I'm thinking, but I noticed that his nose took the brunt of his impact. His nose looked like Mike Perry's nose after Vicente Luque was done with him. And don't look that image up if you have a weak stomach. His nose was smeared across his face like it was cream cheese, but Bobby got his eyes cleared from the tears and he had his weapon drawn just like I did. I had to step up and do the talking on this one because he had taken much more damage than I did. He set the example the first time, so this time I knew what to do. I knew how to step up to this guy. And I'm staring at Dr. Doyle, who's taking a leisurely stroll up to us. And I wait until he's in earshot, not to mention until he's in the perfect range for me to turn him into Swiss cheese. And I tell him something very specific that I meant in that moment. If you don't open this barrier, I promise I'll kill you. And this man replied in the most nonchalant tone, "What do you see?" That smug response lit me up. What do I see? Bro, I'm seeing red right now, but I'm trying to keep it cool and stern. So I reply to him, "Now don't end up dead, Doyle." I thought that was a pretty sweet line that might get through to him and might convey to him just how dead serious I was. But he wasn't picking up on what I was putting down because his response was, "I see the highlands when I look out the glass." And initially, I couldn't put a finger on why that statement was so chilling to me. The pressure in this moment was so intense that scanning my memories for the relevancy in that sentence was borderline impossible. He said, "I see the highlands when I look out the glass." What could he mean by that? I see the highlands when I look out the glass. The glass. Heidi had mentioned the glass when we first met her. She had asked us where we were when we first saw the glass. And when we didn't know what she meant, she corrected herself by asking us where we saw the circle where it shouldn't have been. So the entrance to this place is the glass. And Heidi had asked us where we were when we saw it. And now Dr. Doyle is asking us what we see when we look back through it. Which is pretty much the same question from 2 people. We see where we came from. We found it hiking towards Mirror Lake, just like everybody else here. This is where you guys decided to set up shop for this weird-ass village. What type of freaky mind games are these people playing? All my trust for Heidi is completely out the window at this point, but my reality completely shatters when Dr. Doyle starts speaking again. He goes, "Heidi sees a nice little trail in Saugerties near the Catskill Mountains. Blake and Corey made their way in through Shenandoah, out in Virginia. Roman, bless his heart, stumbled in here through the dancing forest in Kaliningrad. And when I look out this glass, I see the Scottish Highlands. I see the last place that I was before I was here. We all do. Bobby yelled for him to open the barrier again, with real desperation in his voice this time. He was fighting the reality that we were in. He didn't want to believe the conclusions that he was coming to in his own head based on what Dr. Doyle was saying. But Dr. Doyle was patient, as if he had been through exactly what we were going through. Like, I could tell that this guy genuinely felt sorry for us. And he continued by saying, if you guys find a way out before you give up looking for it, please do me a favor and come and get me before you leave. I'll be in the tavern when you're ready to talk, and please don't shoot me in the back. You both know that I'm not capable of all this. He gestured to the entire place, like the village as a whole, when he referred to not being capable of all of this. Then he turned around and slowly made his way back into this bizarre village. We both stood there and watched him walk all the way away from us until he finally entered a small building that resembled a medieval tavern. I look back at Bobby's busted up face, and he's wiping it clean with his t-shirt, and he's doing his best to readjust his nose. I give him a quick, like, dude, you okay? And he gives me a slight nod, like, I'm alright. But he follows up by saying, dude, there has to be a way out. And we don't hesitate for a moment. We immediately start looking for a different exit. We were trying to stay in a mindset that rooted us in our reality, but it's very hard to do that, especially when the problem that you're facing doesn't follow the laws of physics and looks like an optical illusion. And I'm saying that because I know that you're probably thinking, why wouldn't we just walk and push through the tree line to exit this mini forest? It's not like the only exit is this opening in the trees. You could just walk through the foliage. You know, we don't have to climb through this circle in the trees. We could just wedge our way through the forest and find a different exit. We thought that too until we were on the inside looking out. Like, from the outside looking in, we wouldn't have needed to climb through the circle in the trees. We could have pushed by the foliage and entered this small forest. But the circle was on the edge of the tree line from the outside. But from the inside of it, it was not on the edge of the tree line. There wasn't a clearing directly ahead. The only way to the clearing was through this glass, this large circle glass barrier. This is the weird part. There was about 50 yards further of forest behind this glass. You could even walk around it and look at it from the other side. And from the other side, you would see that same still image of where you came from. It looked like it was a floating moment in time encased in acrylic resin. But it wasn't just a standstill photo. When you're looking at this image that's stuck in the glass, the trees are moving in the wind, there's still animals running around. It was more like it was a live video feed, but we couldn't get through it from the other side either. And eventually, of course, you're gonna start to lose hope that it's an exit. Nothing about it makes sense. It's hard as a rock. You can't get through it. It looks like where you came from, but part of it just feels like it's teasing you. You're forced to go and attempt to find another exit. And keep in mind that Bobby and I are in an absolute panic at this point. We both knew exactly what Dr. Doyle was implying with what he told us, but we couldn't get ourselves to grasp the concept. We were in pure denial, doing everything that we could to find an alternate exit. And like I said, there was more forest beyond this glass from the inside. So we figured, let's just keep going in the direction that we knew we came from. This optical illusion has to end somewhere, and it did. Just not in the way that we were hoping that it would. It ended about 50 yards past the glass, through some very dense trees and foliage. And when you go in that direction away from the village, you eventually hit what seemed to be the face of a cliff. And this cliff face was completely vertical, and it was made out of what seemed to be limestone or granite. It was very, very dense. So once we saw that, we figured that we might as well follow this cliff face, and there must be a point where it becomes less steep and we might be able to climb our way out. So we start walking along this stone wall with our left hands touching it to make sure that we're not getting too far away from it, and we start walking clockwise around the village. And we realize when we're about 10 minutes into this walk that we're about halfway around the village, and absolutely nothing had changed. It was as steep as when we found it, and this cliff face seemed to circle the village as if we were in some type of pit. We had fully circled the perimeter after about 20 minutes, and we realized that this cliff face ended right at the point of where the tavern was that Dr. Doyle was waiting for us. But we were still in complete denial. We were not ready to enter. So we turn around, we put our right hands on the wall, and we start walking counterclockwise the other direction just in case we miss something. But we circled this entire place again. We came to the exact same result, and we ended at this point on the other side of the tavern. And the tavern seemed to be built right up against this cliff face. There was nothing behind it. There was no trees behind this tavern. It was as if it was tucked in the point of a cliff. So just so you could picture this properly, this is what the village was like. This is what the landscape was like. Picture an illustration of a teardrop, but the teardrop is lying horizontally. So one side of the teardrop has a point, and the other side rounds out into a much more circular endpoint. The main village and all of the buildings that were in this main village were all closer to the point of the teardrop, with the tavern being placed like directly at that point. And the closer that you got to the center of this teardrop, the less trees there were. There was like clearings and room for structures and just room for people to do daily chores and build stuff, walk around. The center of this place seemed much more lived in, but the closer that you got to the edges of this place, the more dense the trees became. And the deeper that you got into the round side of it, the more that it was just forest. It wasn't lived in at all. But the trees became very, very dense the closer that you got to the cliff walls. So by the time we circled this entire place for the second time and we were back at the other side of the tavern, we realized that this place was completely enclosed by these cliff walls. And our only option was to try to climb out of this thing. The issue was that the canopy of trees was so thick near the walls that we couldn't see how tall the walls actually were. And when you stand closer to the center where there's like less trees and you could see through the canopy, you could only see the sky because you're not close enough to the walls to see how tall they are. And when you look in the direction to the left or the right, it gets too dense. There's a canopy in the way. You can't see the top of these cliffs. So in a sheer panic, Bobby and I try about 10 different methods of shimmying up one of these trees. And we finally find a tree that's fairly easy to climb, and I boost Bobby up until he could reach one of the thick branches. We test to see if it's weight bearing, it could hold his weight. He climbs himself up. He climbs all the way up this tree until he's completely out of my sight. I could barely see him at the top of this tree. Even though he's barely visible, I could tell that he's probably high enough that he could get his head above the leaves and look out of the canopy of this tree. But I don't hear anything from him until he makes his way down slowly and lands on the ground next to me. And he's just shaking his head as if he doesn't want to believe what he just saw. But the guy can't make me wait all day. He's eventually going to have to cough up this information. And in a very discouraged voice, he's just shaking his head saying, they have to be at least 100 feet tall all the way around. Bro, we're gonna need bolts and ropes and gear if we're gonna climb out. And even then, I don't think either of us are skilled enough climbers to do it. Like, dude, we need some serious tools to even make an attempt. So naturally, in the sheer panic of that realization that we're completely surrounded by 100-foot cliff faces in a weird, freaky village, the only thing we could think of doing is circling this place one more time because maybe we missed something on the first two. And we make a half circle. We find ourselves on the furthest end of the round half of whatever this place is. And it was like simultaneously, Bobby and I both felt the defeat. We looked at each other at the exact same moment, and I could tell that he was thinking the exact same thing that I was. I think it's time we both go talk to Dr. Doyle because there's no way we're going to be able to escape this place ourselves. And nobody's trying to hold us here. These walls are holding everybody here. But if we all band together, all these people that are stuck here, we might be able to climb out. All it took was a light, bro, you ready? For both of us to start walking back to the tavern. And like I said, I don't mean to remind you again, all of the buildings were closer to the point of this place. So we start walking in that direction through the forest that is the round side. We noticed that everybody pretty much stayed near the village and near the buildings because we hadn't seen anybody near the edges, and there was clearly nobody wandering around the round side where it's mostly dense forest. We were primarily isolated. But as we're about halfway to the tavern, still pretty deep in this dense forest, we see one villager walking towards us. Not directly towards us where we'll bump into him if neither of us move, but like 10 feet to the left. We weren't going to walk directly into this guy, but we were definitely going to walk past him. And this dude is definitely going through it as well because he's talking to himself. He's got his arms waving around in the air. It was as if he was in this kind of episode where he's going over past arguments in his head and planning future arguments, and his eyes are googling around in every single direction. He's completely cockeyed, looking left and right. And the closer that he keeps getting to us, we could both clearly hear that he's not even speaking English. And I couldn't tell exactly what language he was speaking, but it had to be some type of Slavic language. I couldn't tell if it was Russian, Polish, Bulgarian, or Czech. I could just tell it was one of those, because he was speaking in a very odd cadence. I might have been able to narrow it down, but the way he was talking, there was no way to tell. He had a manic aura to him, and I could tell that even if I spoke the language that he was speaking, this dude wasn't making any sense. He didn't look necessarily dangerous, he just seemed crazy and in his own world. But obviously, we're on high alert. Both of us are staring at this guy just to make sure he doesn't make any crazy moves, and I could see that one of his eyes catch on to the fact that we're looking at him. He immediately stops and whips his crazy head towards us. We don't know what else to do but awkwardly stop with him, staring at him, and just go, "Hey." He was already looking pretty freaky, but after we spoke to him, even though it was only one word, his eyes widened as far as they could go like a predator at midnight, and he spoke one word back to us. He desperately yelled, "Privat," before sprinting towards us like a Call of Duty zombie limp arm. We were already on edge in this scenario, so it's not like he caught us off guard. He didn't have the jump on us, he wasn't able to close the distance efficiently. We were already in defense mode, so right when he started running towards us, we both gave him a shimmy. And we wiggled past this dude easily, got behind him, and both started darting towards the tavern. And once he missed his initial lunge at us, he was far too old to catch up to us. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. The reality was that he was a beaten down older man. And there was no way that he was going to outrun us, especially when he probably used the majority of his energy in his initial sprint and lunge towards us. We didn't bother to stop and look back at him on our way to the tavern. But I kept hearing him yelling the same word that he said to us at first. He was just shouting it in the distance as he was desperately trying to catch up to us. Privat. So we eventually make it into the main clearing of this village where there's random miscellaneous villagers wandering around, doing their seemingly daily chores, just going about their day. And they looked up at us, startled that we were sprinting into the village. And they had a little bit of relief in their face when they saw that it was just us entering the village. But when they were able to start hearing that man shouting behind us, closing in on the village, they all seemed to turn their gaze and duck their heads and pretend as if they weren't hearing it. I thought it was strange, but I didn't have the time to stop and ask these villagers why they were behaving this way, or why they were acting as if they were ignoring this man. That's what it was like. It was like they heard his voice and they were like, "Nope, I don't hear you." But I didn't have time to chop it up with these people. I needed answers from Dr. Doyle. So we quickly opened the tavern door, slipped in, and closed it behind us. And there was a pretty straightforward bolt lock on the inside of this door, so we just took it upon ourselves to go ahead and lock this place up, just in case the man that was shouting and chasing us saw what building we entered, which he definitely did, because a few moments later he was at the door slamming on it, and he was just scratching and clawing and punching at this door, screaming that same word until he seemed to tire himself out. And his shouting eventually turned into what seemed to be like a faint cry, and he kind of gave up and he turned around and we heard him walking back in the direction that he came. The way that he was crying was heartbreaking. There was a level of hopelessness and loneliness in it, and I'd never heard it to that extent before. We had been pressing our shoulders up against the door just in case he was planning on knocking it off his hinges, so we hadn't had the opportunity to turn around and inspect our surroundings yet. But when this guy gave up and our jobs as human door wedges was over, we were able to turn around and take in where we were. We saw Dr. Doyle sitting at a bar, and we looked around and we saw a couple other villagers scattered around this place eating at random tables. This place looked like the type of place that you would stop to have a cauldron of mead after a week-long horseback journey. Everything was made of wood, there was straw all over the floor, and there was a fireplace going in the corner. And even in this dire situation, I couldn't help but to notice how lovely it smelt in there. It smelt like a mixture of vegetables and meats being braised and savory pies being cooked in a wood fire oven. It smelled rich and full of flavor. I couldn't remember the last time me and Bobby ate, and my primal instincts were salivating at the smell of this food. And I think it lowered my guard. I definitely lowered Bobby's guard, because right before that we were in such a hectic panic. But inside of this tavern was rather warm and cozy. And when Dr. Doyle called over to us to join him at the bar, we listened. We didn't give him any pushback. We didn't give him any sass. We didn't start an altercation. Maybe because we were hoping that if we're nice, we could get a meal. Or maybe because we came to terms with the fact that we need to cooperate with this man if we want to figure out, get any gauge on where we are stuck. We sat down next to him and neither of us said anything to him for a few moments. I was just watching Dr. Doyle eat his lunch. And to me, he didn't seem like an evil man. He didn't seem like a man that was keeping us here against our will. He looked like a man in his daily routine, enjoying his lunch the best that he could. And I could see the stress wrinkles on his forehead and the crow's feet near his eyes. And I see quite a few characteristics that I'm very familiar with. He looks like a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he's pretending to be okay. And at this very moment, he's indulging in a routine that helps him cope. He looks like he's been here 100 times in this exact same seat at this exact same bar, with the exact same plate of food in front of him. And I could tell by the way that he's eating, he has a specific way that he eats this dish. He was having some type of beef pot pie, but he clearly had a routine with this dish. There was a correct way to eat it to him. He removed the top of the pie to let the stew steam till it got to room temperature. And as he's waiting for the stew to cool down, he's breaking off pieces of the pie crust and dipping it into the gravy and eating them as chips. And once the stew gravy finally cooled down, he took the pie crust that he removed originally and broke it up into it like he was breaking up crackers into a soup. He ate only the carrots first and then the pieces of celery. Then he ate the peas and the miscellaneous vegetables. Then once there was only meat, gravy, and the bottom of the pie crust left, he broke up all the crust and stirred it together, and he finished it off eating it with large spoonfuls, clearly savoring his favorite part of this dish for last. I knew this was a coping mechanism because it's mine too. We all have little things that give us comfort in our hectic lives, and what he was doing right now is his. And it made me sad in that moment watching him because I saw my young self in what he was doing. I'd search for change and I'd scrape together 50 cents to buy myself a Brown's chicken biscuit. I'd get a serving of the free ketchup and barbecue sauce, and I'd pick off small pieces of the biscuit and I would dunk it into each one of the sauces. And I would put my fingers so far into the sauce that I would eventually mix together until 1/4 of my fingers was also covered in sauce. And I'd put my fingers in my mouth to get all of the sauce in each bite, but I would savor the small piece of biscuit that was inside of each flavor-filled bite. And I'd break the biscuit into 100 small pieces to trick myself into thinking that I had 100 bites of food. And the whole time I would pretend that each bite was from a full meal, and every bite was a different piece from one of the various combo meals. I know that's not exactly the same, but I can tell when someone's coping. I had plenty of those biscuits over the years, and I had a very strict routine on how I ate them, and that routine comforted me. And for some reason, seeing that we shared a trauma warmed me up to the idea of trusting him. And the first thing that he said to us reassured a lot of the conclusions that I was jumping to. Dr. Doyle goes, "I would have given up a long time ago if it wasn't for this place. Because out there, whatever the rest of this place is, it's nothing but suffering. But no matter what happens, no matter who dies, no matter what sick game it throws at us next, I get to come here for a hot meal, a cold drink, and a warm fire. And for 1 hour a day, I feel like I might be okay. It gives me just enough hope to walk back out that door and be the pillar that all of these people need me to be." And there were so many questions flowing through my head in that moment. I wanted to know where we were, first and foremost, but secondly, I wanted to know who was in charge of this place. I also wanted to know about all of the different strategies that he used to try and escape this place. What have they tried already? And I wanted to know about the games that he was referring to because we had encountered them already. And I wanted to know, really wanted to know, who was leaving these games for us. And I wanted to know why he did what he did to Heidi. And I also wanted to know who that Slavic man with cock eyes was that chased us to this tavern. But Bobby asked the question that mattered the most before I was able to come up with any of mine. And it was important because his question had multiple answers to it. From what we knew up until this point, there were some hard to accept conclusions about Bobby and I's future here. There were things that we didn't want to believe. There were things that we didn't think were possible. They were conclusions that we came to about these villagers and about Dr. Doyle. And these conclusions could be proven false based on Dr. Doyle's answer to Bobby's question. And with a glint of fear in Bobby's eyes, Bobby asked Dr. Doyle, "How long have you been here?" And Dr. Doyle put down his cutlery and looked at us for the first time since we sat down next to him. And he said this with true empathy in his voice. 1 year, 2 months, and 18 days. My son turns 4 tomorrow, and he hasn't seen his daddy in 1 year, 2 months, and 18 days. His answer said it all, and it made so much of what he was trying to tell us make sense. And the reality of our situation smacked us in the face. Nobody in this village wants to be here, and everybody in this village is stuck here. Everyone entered whatever this place was from a completely different location, and when everybody looks out of the glass that they came in here from, they see the landscape of where they came from, and everybody sees something different. And the entire village was looking at us with pity because they all remember their first day here. Dr. Doyle looks better than most of the other villagers that are here, so that means that he's been here for far less time than some of them have. And they all had the right to feel sorry for us because they all knew that we weren't going to be able to go home. We were stuck here with them now, and Dr. Doyle asked us if we had kids at home because he didn't want us to go through the same pain that he was going through right now. He had been looking out for us since the moment that we arrived, but the only thing that this didn't explain was what were they doing to Heidi when we first got here? Why was this man being so cruel to a person that clearly trusted him? And when I was about to ask him my follow-up question about Heidi, another man came from around the corner holding 2 plates of food. And this guy had a big smile on his face. He looked to be probably in his 60s. He had a white beard and he had white hair. And he actually looked a bit jolly, as if he wasn't carrying the same pain as everybody else here. He placed the 2 plates of food in front of Bobby and I, and he gave us another big smile. Dr. Doyle thanked him, and he called him Keep, which I could only assume was short for, like, keeper, as if this guy is the keeper of this tavern, the innkeeper. And before he walked back to where he came from, which we can assume is the kitchen, he looked back and said something fairly nice to Bobby and I. He said, "If you ever need to talk to somebody, I'm always here." He clearly was aware of the mental turmoil that we were going through as well. He just didn't seem so upset with his situation. It was different. But Dr. Doyle very quickly explained why his demeanor was so much different than the rest of the village. He waited until the innkeeper was out of the room completely and out of earshot before saying, "Don't envy that man. He's been here longer than all of us. He was born here. He doesn't know anything else. When people have told him about the outside world and all of the great things that are in it, he refuses to listen, and he thinks that it doesn't exist. He thinks that we're the crazy ones, and whatever this place is, it's been his only home. And when it's all you know, it's all you've ever known, it's hard to understand how cruel it is." And his relentless optimism can get on your nerves when you're filled with as much cynicism as I am. But if I'm going to be honest with you, I've come to love his blissful ignorance and his God-gifted culinary talents. Dr. Doyle could see all of the questions that were burning in our eyes, but he insisted that we eat. And he told us that while we're eating, he will continue to talk and explain as much as he can about himself and this place and try to catch us up, but he just wants us to eat. That was music to our ears. We started stuffing our face and listening intently. Dr. Doyle took a big, deep breath and he started a monologue that almost seemed like it was rehearsed because he clearly has done this plenty of times. Because we can only imagine that everybody that shows up to this place probably has a similar reaction to the one that we had, and everybody needs a similar, delicate explanation about the horrors that we're stuck in. This is what he said. "My name is James Doyle and I have a doctorate in philosophy, specifically historical linguistics. I studied lost languages and I was a professor at Trinity University in Dublin where I taught Scottish Gaelic. And if I'm being candid with you, the people of this village are very lucky that I came here, because if it wasn't for me, everybody here would still be living night to night. It wasn't always like this, because before I arrived, nobody understood the rules of this place. And it's not because they were stupid or because they were ignoring obvious signs. They simply couldn't read the language that was being displayed to them. You two have made it back through the gap, so you've both experienced some of the games that this place presents. And I'm not going to pretend like I know why it does it this way. Through that gap into whatever that other place is, for some reason the rules are presented in English. But for some reason, here at the village, All of the rules are presented in Gaelic, and no one here spoke Gaelic until I arrived. So everybody here was ignoring the games that were being presented because they didn't even know how to play. And hopefully, you two are never going to have to learn how dangerous ignoring a game is. And we have something in common. You two went through the same cycle that I did, because I was forced to go through the gap on my first day here, just like you. Apparently what's beyond the gap changes with the seasons. There are 4 different configurations beyond the gap. If you were to go back through the gap tomorrow, you'd see the same configuration that you both saw when you went through the first time. But if you wait until next week when the season changes, you'd come across a completely different configuration. It would be totally different behind the gap. But since an entire year has passed since I went in, I knew that you were entering the same one that I went through, and we're still in summer. But summer ends next week, and I only know these things because of information that past villagers passed down to us. I've come to realize that this place has existed for a very long time, and over the course of who knows how many people and who knows how many lives, some information has been passed down and stored. It's not an impressive amount of information, but at least it's something. But before I arrived here, there must have been some type of reset, because nobody that was here when I arrived knew the rules of this place. Everybody was running around like chickens with their head cut off. But there was clearly a time here where people, or multiple groups of people, understood this place. They understood the rules because they were able to play the games and study it and leave valuable information for us. Bobby very quickly cut off Dr. Doyle's monologue while he still had a mouthful of food. He wasn't trying to cut off the streamline of information that Dr. Doyle was giving us, because we were clearly enjoying it. We were very happy that we were getting filled in, but he just wanted to guide him in the direction towards the information that we wanted the most. He simply goes, "What do you mean they were living night to night?" And Dr. Doyle nods in a very understanding way. He wasn't totally opposed to being cut off. And us chiming in very quickly to change the direction of where he was going helped him give us the highest priority information that we wanted to know the most about. It helped him give it to us quicker. So he slightly changes the direction of his monologue and goes, "Well, since they didn't speak the language and they couldn't understand the rules that were being presented to them." Well, not even just not understand the rules, but not understand that a game was being presented to them in general. They repeatedly ignored them. And if there's one thing that I could say about this place that's abundantly true, is that it punishes you severely if you don't play along. But the games here, the games in the village, are much different than the games that you experienced on the other side of the gap. The games out there are much more like a mission that needs to be fulfilled. But the games in here, the ones that are presented in the village, they're far more cruel than that. They're a bit sadistic, if I'm being honest with you, and there's never a true winner. It never rewards us if we complete one of the games. But we've come to learn that not playing and ignoring them is always worse than just getting it over with and playing. No matter how cruel and terrible the game is, the punishment for ignoring it is going to be infinitely worse, and it's going to punish somebody at random. This place lashes out if you don't play along. So no matter what game it presents, you need to remember that always playing is always better. So I took my chance to chime in because I wanted to know some of the specifics. I found this very interesting. I wanted a couple examples of what these games were going to be like to prep myself. Not because I wanted to hear examples about cruel, sadistic games. I just wanted to be ready for what we are going to experience in the near future. So I go, what kind of games are we talking about here? Then Dr. Doyle looks at the floor, then looks at the ceiling, as if he's trying to recall as many games as he possibly can. And he's shuffling through all of them, trying to figure out which one he's going to use as the examples. And I could tell by his movements that he was very uncomfortable going through his memories. I could see that it was hard for him to have to recall all of these cruel acts that he had to witness. He starts talking again, trying to give us the best answer possible. And through his teeth, he says, "Well, they're always different. They're always very unique and very specific. And some of them are actually ongoing. And actually, that reminds me, I owe you a couple answers about the man that was knocking at the door when you first came in here. And if I explain to you what happened to him, you'll start to understand just how strange these games are. If you recall, I mentioned a man named Roman while we were out by the glass. And I mentioned that he entered here through the dancing forest in Russia. And soon after he arrived, a game was presented that clearly made him a target. And I don't know why this place chose to do that to him. I don't know why it chooses to continue to force us to do it to him. But what I'm assuming, because he was chasing you and yelling, was that you looked his direction. And I'm assuming you might have even greeted him. And I need to warn you, you can never do that again. When he arrived here about 6 months ago, he didn't speak any English whatsoever. Nobody here was able to communicate with him or build a relationship with him. We tried our best, but under these conditions, nobody wanted to be a full-time tutor. And a few days after his arrival, a game popped up that was uniquely evil. Every village member had to agree and choose one village member to completely excommunicate. And it told us that we had 3 minutes to choose upon reading the rules in the sign, otherwise the gap would open. And when the gap opens around here, you never know what's going to come through. And you sure as hell never know how many people are gonna die. As a community, we couldn't risk that. We can't risk the gap opening and people dying at random. We needed to choose in that moment who we were all going to stop talking to. We needed to choose one person that we were all going to pretend literally didn't exist. And these were our options. We choose the person that nobody can communicate with anyway, or we let random people die. We all banded together and we chose Roman. We did it to protect each other. And the most devastating part about the whole situation was that Roman didn't even understand. He didn't know what I was saying when I was translating the rules of the game. He doesn't even know why everybody stopped speaking to him. He doesn't know why everyone that he sees ignores his existence. All he knows is that one day, everybody came together in the forest and no one ever spoke to him again. And people continue to act like he doesn't exist because it's the safest thing for us. We weren't sure how long we had to not talk to him. Maybe after a few months we could start chatting with him again. We didn't know. One village member felt so sorry for him that they broke the silence and they spoke to Roman. They had a conversation with him. They showed him, I see you. I see that you exist. And the very next evening, we found pieces of that said village member scattered all over the forest. We have no idea what happened to them. We don't even know what did it. We only know that it happened directly after speaking to Roman. And before you get worried if you said hello to him or you looked at him, you don't really need to worry about that. There have been slip-ups similar to that, and those people have been fine. But now that you're aware of the rules and you're aware of that game, I wouldn't even risk looking in his direction. You need to convince him that you can't see him if you come across him again. I actually can't even get myself to look at him even if he's not looking at me, because his existence and the punishment that he's going through, it must be pure hell. He walks aimlessly around the village speaking to himself, but it's abundantly clear that he's lost his sanity. And if I were him, I'd probably think that I was a ghost stuck in purgatory. I would probably be questioning my own existence. That game stuck out to me as probably the most cruel. And I think it's a good example to prepare you guys for the life that you're gonna have to become callous to. I had finished my food at that point and I'm sitting there staring at Dr. Doyle. And I found myself with tears welling up in my eyes at the idea of being put into Roman's shoes. It would be absolute torture. It's torture enough being here in general. But being excommunicated and treated like you don't even exist by the only community available is a special kind of cruel. So Dr. Doyle just continues. He tries to follow up this absolutely tragic story with something a bit more lighthearted. I guess he was trying to look at the bright side of Roman's situation. But what he said reminded me of a very big question that I wanted to ask him. This man goes, you know, I'm slightly jealous of Roman in some ways, because when he was excommunicated, he was also removed from any future games, so he doesn't have to deal with them when they pop up. But what I'm really jealous of is that he doesn't ever have to vote, because voting never gets easier. And that rung the bell for me. This must have been the 10th time I've heard this term, the vote. But nobody had been specific up until this point about what people were voting for. Like, he briefly mentioned that everybody had to vote in a majority to excommunicate Roman. But Heidi and Dr. Doyle had both used the term vote in completely different contexts. I could tell it wasn't attached to these miscellaneous games. And I was about to start pushing for a further explanation about the vote when the innkeeper came from around the corner and proceeded to ask us if we enjoyed our meals. We both nodded our heads because they were fantastic. We were very grateful for what he served us. And he picked up our plates, but he also interrupted the moment that we were going to be able to butt in to ask Dr. Doyle to turn the conversation to more information about the vote. And since we didn't get to butt in to ask further, Dr. Doyle just continued, and he brought up a point that he felt was very serious to speak with us about. And in a very gentle way, he said, "We're gonna have to have a discussion about what we're gonna do with your firearms. Nobody else has any here, so people are not gonna like the fact that you have them." And the innkeeper walked away with our plates as if he couldn't care less that we had firearms. But I could tell that Dr. Doyle was serious, and under the circumstances that we were in, it was definitely a serious discussion that we had to have. I was about to say, we could talk about the guns later, but right now, right this second, I'm gonna need more information about that vote. Cough it up. But my train of thought was cut off by a sudden noise that sounded like a small explosion. The sound was radiating through my body, and when it was about halfway through, I realized that it was the sound of a bell, like a bell tower bell, like a big bell. And it gave off a loud, heavy ring. It basically gave Bobby and I a jump scare. But all it did to Dr. Doyle was make him look into his lap as if he was used to the sound. But this sound could not have come at a worse time. The innkeeper came hustling out of the back room and speed walked out of the front door as if, "We need to go right now because that's some type of signal." And the speed in which he was walking made it seem like whatever this bell is, it must be very important. And Dr. Doyle looked at us very sternly and told us that we have to go right now. He wasn't going to be able to not give us any explanation about what this bell sound is, so he kept it very brief, but what he said thoroughly convinced us that we needed to follow him immediately. He said, "I was hoping you guys would have more time to settle in, but the bell only gets rang when somebody has come across a game. I'm very sorry, but for everybody's safety, we need to go right now. And you two are one of us now. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. I cannot guarantee your safety where we're going. We never know what we're walking into, but if the game allows it, I'll do my best to sway the brass. This is very unfortunate, but because you guys don't know anybody here, you might be easy targets." And my heart starts racing as we got up and started following him out of the tavern. I had no idea what kind of hectic game I was walking into. I didn't know if it was going to be something physically competitive or some type of riddle or some type of trivia. There was no telling what this was going to be. And just like every other sentence that he has said to us so far, there was something in there that I didn't understand that I wanted a further explanation about. He said if he could sway the brass, he would try to help us. But apparently it all depends on the game that's presented. And at this point, gonna be honest, I was very sick of not knowing what was going on. I was sick of not knowing the terminology of this place, and I was definitely sick of not feeling like I was in control. Part of me wanted whatever this game was to be some type of competitive game. For the simple fact that if I'm allowed to compete, at least I have some type of control over my fate. I didn't know any of these people, and none of these people knew me. But maybe I can make a statement on this first game that I'm not a pushover, I'm not somebody to be messed with. I don't know if I was expecting to walk up to some type of obstacle course, but it definitely wasn't what I was expecting. It also wasn't where I was expecting it to be. I felt like it was going to be presented right in the heart of the village, but for some reason, it was in a dense, deep part of the forest. And it wasn't anything extravagant. It was, again, a random table, like the one that we saw when we were out in the gap. And again, there was a random sign next to it. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason why this game was presented where it was. And I can only assume that that meant that they pop up in random places. Because when Dr. Doyle heard the bell, he said that somebody found a game. So that would imply that you had to go looking for them, which in that moment I realized that that was just another sick, twisted part of this whole thing. They don't just show up and present themselves to you, they pop up randomly in a random location around this general area at a random time. And the village members have to walk around, go looking for them just in case, so you don't miss them. Because if you miss one, it punishes you for ignoring it. So it's like you have to go looking for punishment. But anyway, the entire village has approached this random game and has surrounded it in a very dense part of the round side of the forest. And I start to think about our time in the gap where we had to take the cup, fill it with ink, and fill up the jar in order to get to the next section. So I'm looking on the top of the table to see what item goes along with this game. and all I see is one of those kind of like velvet string bags. Like imagine one of those types of bags that you would imagine a prince would hold a bundle of gold coins in. Or like one of those magician bags that have an endless bottom. And it was very clear as we were walking up to this game and as everybody was circling around it, that Dr. Doyle had major pull in this community. It was very clear that he had a lot of respect from most of these people. He was a very clear leader amongst pretty much everybody, but there also seemed to be an underlying animosity towards him. And I know that people that are stuck in this place must be on their last nerve at all times. And it must be very easy to get under people's skin or to have people become upset with you. But they were looking at him a little bit different than that. They didn't seem to just be irritated in general. They seemed to be annoyed that they had to wait for him for the game to start. They didn't seem to like that position of power, at least half of them didn't. And I wasn't really sure why they were showing that level of animosity towards him until I saw the way that he presented the game. Also the way that he read the sign before he even started speaking. And just like he said, the sign was written in Gaelic here, and nobody else could read it. All of us would just be buffoons attempting to translate it. So we had to stand there and we had to wait for him. But as I remember from the games that we played Beyond the Gap, it didn't just give you a very clear list of rules. The one that we encountered said it in like a weird poetic way that you had to decipher. And I noticed that he didn't read the sign out loud to everybody. And I could tell that that annoyed people because some people from the crowd, in a very antagonizing tone, shouted out, "Why don't you read it out loud, Doyle? We'd all love to help you solve the riddle." And wouldn't you know it, it was the same girls that were whispering in our ears when we first arrived back here. Blake was clearly the ringleader of whatever subdivision of this village had disdain for Dr. Doyle and Heidi. And she was shouting for him to read it out loud as if she was bringing up an old argument that they've all had dozens of times. And I looked to Bobby, who I haven't had a one-on-one conversation with since we entered the tavern. And he asked me, like, dude, what do you think that's about? And I start to think over the dynamics of why she would want him to read it out loud to everybody. And why something like that would be a sore subject. Until it hit me. If he read every single riddle out loud, word for word, people would be able to start attaching the words that are in English to the words that are in Gaelic, and they would start to be able to translate it themselves. And if they started to actually learn Gaelic and became confident that they can decipher these riddles and understand the games without Dr. Doyle, then they wouldn't need him anymore. So Dr. Doyle must be purposely not reading them out loud, and he deciphers the riddle himself so he doesn't give anybody any power over him. He stays necessary. And then he must tell everybody in his own words what the game needs everybody to do. He was protecting his skill for some reason. He was protecting his worth in this village. And initially I thought maybe it's so he doesn't end up like Roman and get excommunicated. Or maybe it's so he could have more power inside of the community. But there was something else going on here. He was clearly being very protective of his skill. And the people that didn't have the skill wanted to cause drama around it. They wanted to rally the troops against him, to force him to teach other people. They were trying to make an enemy out of him, so he would give up the biggest advantage that he had of surviving out here. But it wasn't clear to me why they were trying to do this. I didn't really understand the motive. I guess the games, I guess maybe so he doesn't get excommunicated, but it wasn't obvious. I didn't understand the turmoil here. It definitely didn't have to do with the fact that it takes him long to decipher these riddles, because he was already done. He figured it out in about a minute, and I could tell that he knew exactly what we needed to do. I could tell that he knew what the game was. He was just trying to figure out how he was going to convey it to the group. And clearly, it was not anything good. Based on the other game that he told us about, I was absolutely positive that this game was going to have a consequence that hurt somebody. But I could tell he was really contemplating how he was going to deliver this message, and he was very, very stressed about it. And Bobby and I are both bracing for impact because we have no idea what to expect. Then Dr. Doyle looks up at us directly, and I could tell he has something very serious that he has to say to us, but he doesn't want to say it. And Bobby could tell too, so he shouts over to Dr. Doyle like, "Hey, it's okay. Just say it." We had built up a little bit of trust with him in the time that we spent with him. So even if this was going to be something that was messed up and maybe potentially traumatize us, we wanted to give him the green light that we're big boys, it's going to be all right. It's okay, just tell us. Because if this is where we are now, and this is the game that we need to play, We're gonna have to get used to it someday, so why not today? And Dr. Doyle finally breaks his silence by saying, guys, I just want you to know, I'm okay with whichever decision you make, and I'm not going to judge you. I promise nobody here is going to judge you. But this place, man, it never makes it easy. But I'm begging you guys to make a decision. Even if it's a bad decision, you need to make a decision, because something worse will happen if you don't. So right then, we know this game is about us. We know that we're going to be the pawns of whatever this is. It's probably not going to be good, but nothing prepared me for the psychological torture that this game brought to me. Dr. Doyle was very quick with his explanation of the game. He didn't say what the riddle said. He said his interpretation of the riddle to protect his skill. He said, we have two options here, everybody. Option one, the two newcomers can put both of their firearms in this bag and leave them behind, or the entire group can vote for one leader. And that one leader is going to choose the two people that these men are going to have to shoot to keep their firearms. Does that make sense to you? You could either hand them over, or we can choose one person and give them the power to choose two people that you can then kill to keep your guns. I felt frozen in time in that moment. I couldn't believe what that man just said to me. And not just because of how morbid it is, but because the idea of the group having to choose a leader, and then that leader has the power to choose two people that get sacrificed, but we're the ones that have to do the sacrificing. And this is all based on us wanting to keep our firearms, which, if we did want to keep them, it would make us look extraordinarily selfish. And also, make us murderers. It made me start to question everything in that moment. I had just started getting comfortable in this new reality. I just started accepting what was happening to us. But now it felt like everything up until this point was a ploy to get us to give our guns away. And everything before this was a facade to disarm us. I felt like everybody around us was an actor, and all of them were just trying to get me to give away my firearm. And right when I did, they were going to swarm on us and take us prisoner and sacrifice us in some weird ritualistic cult. All of this trust that I had built up with Dr. Doyle and these villagers that I started to feel sorry for was completely gone in that moment. I felt like they were all in on it. I felt like they were conspiring against me. I felt like I was in the Truman Show and everybody was just trying to get me to give up my firearm, and the only thing I wanted to do was keep it. If Dr. Doyle is able to keep his skill that keeps him safe here, why am I not allowed to keep my firearm? But then when I thought deeper about it, it didn't really make sense. Because why would we have to kill two of their people to keep them? Why would this village of people that was potentially conspiring against me put up two people of their own? And the reward for that is I get to keep my firearm. Like, I could leave this situation with it. Like, there was an option here where I get to take out two of their people scot-free, nobody cares, and I get to keep my advantage. If they were all in on it and they were all conspiring, they would never give me those terms. And Dr. Doyle put even more pressure on us, telling us that we didn't have much time to make this decision, but he reassured us that he would be okay with either decision. He even expanded by telling us that people here have done far worse, and that no matter our decision, we have nothing to be ashamed of. He continued by saying that it's our first day here and nobody would look at us different. But I'm internally battling all of these weird thoughts, because this could also be them dragging me into this weird cult. Like, they're trying to convince me to kill somebody, and then they'd be able to blackmail me so I can't report them when I finally find an exit out of this place. My head was spinning in that moment so much that I thought I might pass out. I thought my lunch was going to come up, and I had no idea what to do until somebody in the crowd of villagers raised their hand as a volunteer. And I look up, and it's that chick Blake. That conniving girl is volunteering to be the leader to choose the two people that we would have to kill if we want to keep our guns. And then I see another hand pop up, and it's Heidi. And she's obviously volunteering because she knows if Blake is the leader, she's probably going to choose Heidi for the person that we have to kill. They both start playing politics, trying to rally the group to vote for them to be the leader. And the entire scene breaks out into an absolute frenzy of people whispering in each other's ears. And it kind of made sense, because if I were in their position, I would think that I was fighting for my life. I have to choose the right leader that's definitely not going to choose me as the sacrifice. But even though I'm understanding why they're acting so crazy, I'm nowhere closer to an answer. I have no idea what we're gonna do, and I could tell that Bobby has no idea what we're gonna do either. And another major issue about this is when I come to my conclusion, when I make my decision, is Bobby gonna wanna make the same decision, or are we gonna try to do two different things? And as I'm thinking about that horrible scenario of Bobby and I arguing about what decision to make, a third hand pops up in the crowd. He's also volunteering. But this volunteer is very different because once he volunteered, everybody stopped whispering and they let him emerge from the crowd. So I'm looking this guy up and down, and like I mentioned earlier, how a lot of these village members have like various scars and like maybe an eye patch or like a chunk ripped out of their ear or their arm or some type of physical injury. This man seemed to have everything under the sun. It looks like somebody dropped him in a blender and hit the pulse feature a couple times before plucking him out. This man was mangled, and he was clearly not volunteering to be the leader. This man was volunteering to be put out of his misery. I didn't think that that was going to be an option here, where two people were going to ask to be put down. But in a place like this, it unfortunately seemed normal. Nobody was gasping or begging him not to. People seemed more relieved than sorry for him, because these people are potentially fighting for their life, and him volunteering is taking one of their places and making their odds 50% better. So I whip my head towards Bobby. I'm absolutely freaking out, and I'm hoping that he's gonna be the first one of us to express his opinion, because I don't even know what my opinion is. The pressure of this entire situation is clouding my decision making, and I feel in that moment, if I hear his opinion, I will be able to feel in my chest if I disagree with his opinion or not. So I'm looking at him, we don't know what to say, and then Dr. Doyle says, 10 seconds, and Bobby looks me right in the eyes and says, nobody's dying today. I waited for the visceral feeling in my chest to see if I disagreed with him, and it didn't come. I wasn't sure if I was going to feel the need to keep my firearm so strongly that I was going to have to convince him that he needed his. His answer and his opinion on the situation relieved me immensely because I felt the exact same way. Either these people around us were the absolute best actors, or this was the most sadistic game in history. So we run up to Dr. Doyle and we take our firearms out of our holsters and we jam them into the bag that's on the table and close the string. We didn't know if he meant 10 seconds to make a decision or 10 seconds to put them in the bag, but we had already made our decisions internally. So we put them in the bag as quickly as we possibly could. Dr. Doyle whispered to us that he was very proud of our decision and that he thought it was brave for us to give them up. That made me feel a little bit better about it, especially when I could feel the energy of the group calm down. And everybody seemed to be fairly happy with our decision because nobody had to die. But then I heard one voice from the crowd shout, "They're unarmed, get 'em." I turned around ready to throw haymakers at anybody approaching me. My worst nightmare came true in that one sentence. All of this was completely made up, and everybody in this group was conspiring against us to disarm us. We were going to have to fight for our life in this exact moment. I loaded up my right hand ready to send it across anybody's temple, but all I see is one girl giggling in the crowd of people, and everybody else is looking at her very annoyed. But she looks so satisfied with the panic that she put into me. Blake shouted that as a way to tease us. It was as if she knew what I was internally worried about in that situation. And when we made the decision that we wanted to make, instead of giving her the opportunity to be the group leader, she punished us for that publicly. And she was laughing about it as if it was some type of initiation, like, you gotta get your whippings. And she's walking up to us as if she's gonna continue to talk to us as if we might find her joke funny too, and we're gonna start having banter. And I see why Heidi hated this girl. I didn't want anything to do with her. Nothing. Like, part of me wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt because she's been in this horrible place for so long. And she was clearly coping with it with a horrible sense of humor. But to attempt to tease us and to make us the butt of the joke after that horrible situation came off as completely tone deaf and distasteful. But she seemed to be absolutely shameless about it, because once she got up to us, she immediately followed up with something just as tone deaf. In a snobby little weaselly tone, she said, "I heard you guys met Corey." And I thought back to the bickering that her and Heidi had about the fact that Corey was Blake's fiance. There was clearly some type of relationship drama and animosity there between Heidi, Corey, and Blake. But if she had heard that we had met Corey out in the Gap, she would have also heard that her fiance died a horrible, gruesome death. We found that man choking on endless black ink, unable to see and unable to hear. He was gasping for air as black ink was pouring out of his bowels. And she's talking about him like he's her little ex-boyfriend that she didn't like in high school. But this man was her fiance. Then she followed up with something again that made me feel even more uncomfortable with her presence. She said, "He wasn't man enough to make it through like you two. Two big, strong men." And she said it in this flirty, salacious, manipulative, horrible tone. I couldn't tell if she was mocking us or actually trying to manipulate us, because I couldn't imagine that this worked on anybody. Like, all it did was make it seem like she was an emotionalist monster that only cared about getting people onto her side to tear others down. But before we're even able to respond to this psycho, Heidi comes in, breaking up the conversation between us again. Heidi is clearly trying to protect us from this venomous woman. So Heidi barges over and she barks at Blake to get away from us. But this Blake girl was not scared of Heidi's East Coast attitude. She was clearly antagonizing her, looking for an altercation anytime they interacted. And then Blake says something that's clearly a dig at Heidi. You know when somebody says something that you don't fully understand the relevance of, but after they say it, the person that they said it to is going to have to explain the relevance of what they said to you because they feel embarrassed about it. Blake clearly did that in this situation because what she said to Heidi was, "Did you tell them about you and Corey? Or did you tell them about you and Steven? Or are you going to tell them how you started with Steven, tried to take Corey from me, and now you're going to try to hop to one of them?" Heidi just repeated herself for her to get away from us. But Blake just said one more thing before she left. And it was obvious that she was trying to instill the most distrust that she could. "Did you tell them that the brass chooses who they vote for and that they don't have a say? Or are you going to tell them that they're eventually going to have to volunteer because they're ready?" Then she even more mockingly says, "The brass are in charge. How did you end up out there?" To be honest, Blake's tactics were kind of working. And it wasn't because we didn't trust Heidi. We had built up a little bit of rapport with her and Dr. Doyle. We'd been through a lot with her. But the things that Blake were saying were vague enough that we had to question Heidi about them after. Because even though there was little meaningless drama, there were small bits in there that were relevant to us that we needed more information on. Again, the term "the vote" came up and the term "the brass" came up. And this was the second time she referred to some type of relationship between Heidi and Corey. But this was the first time we heard the name Steven. Dr. Doyle was busy. He was getting pulled in another direction with some of the villagers. So our time to talk with him was over for now. But this was the first time we were able to talk to Heidi since we tried to escape. And we could tell that she was extremely embarrassed with all of the things that Blake said in front of us. Because Blake was insinuating that she got around a bit. I don't know how else to say that. I don't know how else to sugarcoat it. But anybody that was in Heidi's position would feel like they would need to defend their character. And as juicy as the relationship drama inside of this village was, I was more interested in the votes and the brass. But Heidi was clearly more interested in clearing her name. So at this point, all of the villagers are dispersing from this sick gathering in this horrible game. And Heidi started walking in the direction of some of the other buildings that we hadn't been in. And she clearly wanted us to walk with her. So we followed suit without saying much because we were still trying to calm down from the pressure that we were just under. And as curious as we were, it was very hard to muster up the right questions about the right topics coming out of that game. So luckily, Heidi just started word vomiting. She just started desperately defending herself by saying, "Blake is an evil person. She's saying things so far out of context, trying to manipulate you. She doesn't care about anything other than building an alliance and manipulating as many people as possible. All she wants to do is get them to vote with her so she could be in charge here. She hates the fact that Dr. Doyle's in charge, and she hates the fact that she can't manipulate me into working against him." Listen, the stuff that she's been saying about me and Corey is true. I'm not gonna lie to you and say that it wasn't. But it's so much more complicated than that. Blake was nothing like this when she first got here. She's changed. This place changed her in every way, and her and Corey's relationship fell apart naturally. It was way before Corey and I started talking. Corey left her and he joined the brass, but she was still obsessed with him. But she was obsessed with him in a messed up way. And she took this place as an opportunity to get back at anybody that crossed her. When Corey joined the brass, she had a vendetta against him and lied about him to everybody to turn the whole village against him. She lied through her teeth about him to everybody that would listen. She told everybody that he was abusive to her to put him on the outs, but I caught her giving herself bruises, and I overheard her talking to him about all of the things that she was planning on doing to him. She is cruel and manipulative, and he deserved better. And for her to bring up Steven, for her to act like me and Steven are even remotely together, like what he did to me wasn't relationship ending. She saw what he did to me. She was the one that put us in the position for him to do that to me. For her to act like Corey and I building something together is some cheating scandal is crazy. She's the one that ended Steven and I's relationship. She got voted in a game to be a leader, and she chose Steven and I to be a pair. She forced us to play a game together when she could have chosen anybody, and the game was extremely simple. The leader chooses the pair to make a decision, and the decision was to either save yourself or save the other person. She chose Steven to make that decision, for either me or him to live. And I wish that she would have chosen me, because I would have chosen for him to live, because I love that man with all of my heart. But she chose him, and she counted down from 5. When she reached 1, Steven said, "I don't want to die." I was completely betrayed in that moment. I couldn't believe that the man that I thought I was gonna marry saved himself instead of me. I didn't know how they were gonna kill me. I didn't know what happened next, but it was so much worse than dying. In a snarky voice, after she orchestrated the moment, Blake said, "Now you have to live with that decision." Nobody had to die in the game. It was only about making a decision to either be a hero or a coward. She could have chosen anybody in the village, and neither of them would have died. She could have chosen 2 people that didn't know each other, and neither of them would have taken it personally. If it's a complete stranger, and you choose to live, and nobody ends up dying, that person isn't going to have a vendetta against you because they would have done the same thing. She chose me and Steven and had Steven choose to try to drive a wedge between us, and it worked. I haven't spoken to that man since. I can't even look at the man without getting nauseous. And since then, he's had nowhere to go, so he's been her little puppet ever since. He does whatever she says because no one respects him. He's on the bottom of this place, and she's the ringleader, and she's the only one that can keep him safe. Everyone was disgusted with what he did to me. She basically turned him into a pet. And yeah, Corey and I bonded over our hate for Blake, but she is relentless, and she got into everybody's ear 2 weeks in a row, and she was able to blindside Corey, and you saw what happened to him. Then somehow she was able to flip 2 members of the brass, and that's what you guys saw. You walked in on them blindsiding me. People think that the games here are the most dangerous thing, but it's her. That woman is a nightmare. We let Heidi get all of that off of her chest so she didn't feel like she was a bad person. We wanted her to feel like she had her chance to tell her side of the story. And it all kind of made sense. We believed her. The way Blake acts is horribly inappropriate and incredibly manipulative. She's clearly a bully around this village, and she's power hungry, and she's trying to get under everybody's skin. But realistically, all of that drama didn't mean anything to us. I couldn't care less about these relationship scandals. I want to know, what is the brass and what are they talking about with this vote? Why is she talking about blindsides? Nobody's giving us a clear answer on what this is. So I very frustratedly say to her, why are you talking to me like I know what you're talking about? We just got here. What's the brass? Why do you keep talking about voting? And Heidi looks super surprised. She's taken aback. And she starts off by saying, Dr. Doyle didn't tell you? One must go every week, no later than noon, but voted so by friends who lie and swoon. We're all forced to vote every week, and the person that has the most votes is given to the gap. None of us are safe. I hope you're enjoying these longer, scarier, darker videos. And I hope you take my advice when I tell you, you should probably like the video. Otherwise, you might get fed to the gap.